Now, you're welcome back. We are turning to tennis. Novak Djokovic will return to defend his Australian Open title after revealing he has secured a medical exemption for the tournament. He is on his way to Melbourne for more. Very happy to say we have Caitlin Thompson of Racquet Magazine with us. Hey, Caitlin.
Hi there. How's it going?
It's never dull around Novak Djokovic. There was a countdown around what would happen with Djokovic and the Australian Open, given that vaccinations were mandatory unless it turns out you get a medical exemption. Was there talk amongst the tennis world that that was the route he was trying to go down?
Absolutely. I think as soon as they announced medical exemptions would be on the table for this tournament, and to be clear, the Australian Open and Australia itself, as many of your listeners know, has been among the most stringent and strict about letting unvaccinated or COVID positive folks into the country, instituting last year a mandatory 2-week lockdown upon arrival for tennis players there to play the Australian Open. So I think this year announcing that there was going to be a medical exemption put basically everyone in the tennis world on watch, specifically towards Novak Djokovic. He wasn't the only person who was thought to be applying, but certainly the most high profile, and as the defending champion, somebody who has been outspoken about being anti-vax and sort of famously getting into a lot of hot water about this. So we've been all kind of waiting for this to happen. And now that it has, Twitter at least is abuzz with a lot of hot takes.
Well, Jamie Murray had his own hot take as well. He was playing at the ATP Cup, for instance, and he was part of a press conference, and the Djokovic news had just landed, and it was put to Jamie Murray. And his hot take was, well, if it was me that wasn't vaccinated, I wouldn't be getting an exemption. But well done to him for getting clearance to come to Australia and compete, and the others alongside him were almost covering their faces and laughing. So Jamie Murray's take, like a lot of people's, is, well, defending champion, world number one, his medical exemption really boils down to the fact that he's high profile, and they've just found enough wiggle room for him to make his way through. Now, the Australian Open are coming out and saying that's absolutely not the case. The medical exemption works on the basis of 2 different panels signing off on this. One of the panels appointed by the government. It's not like the tennis officials here seem to just handpick a couple of people that they've control over. It's a government-chosen panel, and according to Victoria State, the personal information of anyone who's applied for this exemption, it remains very much personal, and so the information is redacted as part of the process. I mean, the criteria that they list ranges from acute major medical conditions. It ranges from previous doses of COVID-19 vaccination resulting in very serious symptoms, or you could have tested positive for COVID-19 in the last 6 months. They seem to be the criteria. The truth is, whether you're in the Jamie Murray camp or whether you think it's one of these issues outlined as part of the criteria, we don't know how Djokovic has managed to get the exemption.
We don't. And I think, one of my favorite theories, completely unfounded, I should add, but one of my favorite theories is that he has been very outspoken about his reluctance to vaccinate, the privacy he feels like he is owed, despite doing a job that affects a number of other people, especially in a place that's endured more hardship than most. Thinking about Victoria, the state of Australia specifically. My working theory is he might actually already have the vaccine, and he just doesn't want to sort of show compliance. I have no facts to back that up other than Novak Djokovic seems to work well in adversity, and going into this tournament without the entirety of the tennis world in mass against him might actually be a bit of a disadvantage. If anybody who watched the finals of the US Open where he had the crowd on his side but couldn't perform might be tempted to think. So, the truth is we don't know, but I would love in his case, because so much of what his work theoretically off the court, founding the PTPA, the Professional Tennis Players Association, under the guise of helping not just the top echelon of players, but all the players. One of the things that they would be great to do, putting their money where their mouth is to make transparent his process and say, hey, listen, this isn't favoritism, and here's why, because we're going to show you what it is that he was able to get an exemption for. So, again, I think it's not so much for me the idea of anything other than the hypocrisy of it, or the apparent hypocrisy, the lack of transparency. And it's hard not to feel like the Australian Open handled this in potentially the worst possible way it could have, in both seeming to acquiesce to Novak Djokovic, but also not being clear or transparent about its own process. And obviously I have my own opinions about how they should have handled things from the start, but it's hard to say that they could have done worse than what is appearing to happen at this moment.
If he was secretly vaccinated, he wouldn't need a medical exemption.
He wouldn't. No, I actually think there's a lot of performance that he is capable of pulling off because he has been quite popular among anti-vaxxers. A lot of his followers, especially the sort of Serbian nationalist folks who tend to really support him in the crowd, the social media. Anybody who talks about tennis on social media will have encountered some of them. They are known as Knoll Fam, but sort of disparagingly or occasionally called Mole Farm. These are folks who applaud Novak Djokovic's position against vaccines and have taken it upon themselves to further spread mistrust and anti-vax sort of propaganda. And I think for him, appearing to give credence to their beliefs while secretly doing something that was maybe beneficial for himself, at least in this country, in America, where I'm sitting, having seen a lot of right-wing Republicans do the very same thing, discouraging vaccination while secretly getting vaccinated themselves, it's not crazy to think that that could be happening here.
You mentioned the state of Victoria, which has endured 260 days of lockdown across the pandemic. They have a 90% vaccination rate, a huge uptake there. Djokovic, as you mentioned, may well, I mean, who knows what's going on, but we can assume for a moment he's unvaccinated. I was reading, and I don't know if you've heard similar, but I was reading he remains just one of 5 unvaccinated players in the top 100 of the men's tennis rankings, a number that was revealed recently by a spokesperson for the ATP Tour. Is that about the figure you've heard as well? Because, I mean, just to take, Premier League here, soccer, there's huge vaccine hesitancy amongst footballers, for instance.
That's encouraging to hear if that's true. I have heard much, much more sort of dire numbers. The WTA sort of famously has been outpacing the men, the Women's Tennis Association, in terms of vaccine adoption. And I've heard way, way, way more than 5 out of the top 100. That said, if that's the current number and that's a vetted number, that's actually really encouraging because my assumption and things I had seen prior to hearing that indicated that there's much, much more player sort of hesitancy, among the men, not the women, which again is, I think, probably a gender divide that is occurring not only among professional athletes, but just generally in society. And I can obviously pontificate about why that is, but I have even written a Eurosport column to the effect of, to me, if you don't want to get a vaccine, don't get a vaccine. However, you absolutely cannot endanger folks by getting on planes, going into restaurants, and certainly not waltzing into a country that's endured, as you said, more than 200 days of lockdown in the state of Victoria specifically, but also the people who are required in a lot of cases to be vaccinated to work, to attend to you, to be physios, to be masseuses and the like. So, my opinions are very, very clear on this. You can look them up on the internet. But to me, the opt-in nature of playing professional tennis, especially as the number one player ranked in the world, as he is, and the sort of theoretical role model that he wants to be seen and beloved to be. Again, it's a great opportunity for him to kind of come out and say, hey, we live in a society, this is the right thing to do, as of his peers have done. But, again, Novak seems to like causing controversy, which is kind of why I have my wild theories about what actually might be going on, despite not actually having any evidence of those.
I find him a very difficult person to get a handle on. I don't understand him, and you would spend far more time around him and listening to him and probably thinking about him than I do. I mean, the pandemic, for one, he's had a bad pandemic. I think clearly in a lot of our minds, some strong memories from the pandemic will be, Djokovic going out very much as an anti-vaxxer early on, and the tennis tournament in June and the pictures in the nightclub, and it turns out pretty much everybody there ends up getting COVID, including Djokovic and his wife and a bunch of those players. And even, if Nick Kyrgios is saying you're a bonehead, then you've really messed up. So they're my lingering memories of Djokovic, and then all through this year, the anti-vax cloud hanging over him, I suppose. And yet, all I see and hear about this guy is that he is desperate to be loved. He arrived third on the scene after Nadal and Federer, and so naturally there's a slight loyalty to those two maybe, and he's about to break the record. And we saw at the US Open when he missed out in the calendar Grand Slam on the court. I mean, he was so emotional, and US fans, you finally love me, and oh my God, this means more than anything, and my heart's so full, and just desperate to be loved, and then at the same time playing the great contrarian over the last couple of years. So I don't know what complexities are going on here, but I struggle to get a handle on them. He's obviously a complicated person.
Clearly. Yeah. And neither do I, to be completely candid. I think, we only really have people's word and actions to judge them by, right? And I think, when you're in the spotlight, as many of these players, especially the ones who have won multiple Grand Slams, find themselves to be, what we project onto them and what they actually believe or want to be seen believing or purporting are not always the same thing. Frankly, it's one of the reasons sport is so interesting, because we not only have their words to sort of take them by, but also their actions on the tennis court. What I can tell you, having watched Novak Djokovic play for the last 15 years, having met him and hit some tennis balls with him when I used to work at Time Magazine, he's funny, he's charismatic. Obviously, he's brilliantly intelligent. He speaks fluent Serbian, Spanish, French. I think he's got a pretty good handle on Italian and obviously English. He's got plenty to recommend him by, and not least of which is being the most dominant male tennis player, certainly in the past decade, and probably ultimately the one who's going to end up having lifted the most Grand Slam trophies. That said, it is so hard to understand how one could want to be loved this much and continually do things to aggravate, inflame, and further divide the sort of tennis world, that all they want to do is wrap their arms around a hero, especially after having had two on the men's side, arguably three with Andy Murray, who we had to sort of put on those mantles. Again, imperfect people with imperfect records and imperfect, maybe thoughts or actions, but clearly folks who have kind of earned or leaned into their role model element a little bit more. And, what was so shocking to me about Novak Djokovic is, as you noted, wanting to be loved so much that he created an alternate body of tennis players, a non-union union at last year's U.S. Open about 18 months ago, specifically with the idea that he wanted to be seen as this leader. He wanted to lead. He wanted to advocate for the betterment, at least of the men. They didn't include any women, although there's overtures apparently that have happened since. And you think, okay, well, sure, put your money where your mouth is. Let's do this. What do you want to be standing for? Do you want to kill appearance fees, which would cut into the amount that everybody gets paid to play a tournament? Do you want to negotiate on behalf of the players for getting more of the take of these Grand Slams? Do you want to include women? Do you want to, there's a number of different ways, including this, like adopt a domestic violence policy, like many other leagues do. Adopt a way to maybe make the sport more inclusive or equitable. Certainly get the public health of the athletes and the trainers and the umpires and the governing bodies who all educate these events, put them first. You do the right thing, and he can't, and he won't. And I just don't know what to say about it, other than every time we have one of these chats, I get a whole flood of, sort of Serbian nationalists, talking to me about how much I hate him and how I'm biased towards Nadal and Federer. The truth is, I'm ready for all three of them to be done with the tennis world, because I think the sport is so much better and more interesting than three names. But unfortunately, we keep talking about this one name, especially in the context of the three names, because they break through. And in Novak's case, he cannot stop pairing on-court excellence with off-court buffoonery. And this is another example of the latter category.
Yeah, there's a parallel there with golf. It can't quite shake Tiger at the moment. It's hanging on to Tiger by its fingernails. And in fairness, Djokovic was on for a calendar Grand Slam last year, so he's far more relevant than even Tiger. I did read one theory that it's difficult for us to fully appreciate the extent to which he is a god in his home country. His approval rating is 100%.
Explains a lot, actually, about him and why there's a very funny documentary about Metallica, starring, obviously, tennis prodigy, famous drummer Lars Ulrich, talking to his dad, who happened to be one of the greatest Danish tennis players of all time, and a jazz clarinetist and an artist and all this stuff. And he's listening to one of their albums, and he looks at him and he goes, I think you are in, how do you say, like an echo chamber? And I think about that all the time with regards to Novak Djokovic, because this guy is the most famous Serb ever. Yeah. He represents this post-Yugoslav splitting up, children of war, made good redemption story. He's fabulously rich. He's fabulously famous, and
and talented and brilliant.
Clearly and talented, and the greatest tennis player, possibly, at least on the men's side, that we've seen ever in terms of results. he's going to be the president of Serbia if he wants to be. And many people think he's going to be. I also think, having spent a little bit of time understanding that region, working on a documentary film about, the mass rapes in Foča, for example, and the Bosniak, Serbian, Croat conflict, they really function well when they feel like they are embittered and embattled. And I think there's a lot of that mentality that goes on with him, where he thinks, this is me against the world. We have to prove yet again, nobody wants to believe in us. And here we are, discounted and underdog. And you guys hate Nadal. You guys hate Djokovic because you love Nadal and Federer, even if that's not true, even if nobody, everyone has sort of moved on from those folks. And I think there's really a lot to that specific context in which he's operating, where he is a god king, and he's possibly in a bit of an echo chamber, because he is not hearing, at least from the kind of agents or PR people who anybody else would say, you know what, maybe just don't say that out loud. Maybe don't post an Instagram picture about how you got a medical exemption. Maybe don't fan these flames. You don't need to. Your tennis speaks for itself. So just keep winning and shut everybody up that way. But he can't. And so I have to believe that he needs not only to be victorious, which he has been more than he hasn't. He needs to be loved, which at times he is. And I think more than anything else, he needs to be right. And the truth is, he's not on a lot of this stuff when it comes to not holding a tennis racket. And I think that's sort of all related. So I'm glad you brought it up, because it's the closest I've seen to explaining this incredible paradox in great tennis player and let's call it like a searcher as a person, searching to do the right thing and coming up so short so often.
Okay. Absolutely fascinating. Caitlin Thompson, an excellent accent as well thrown in there. We always appreciate that. Of Racquet Magazine. Thanks so much, and we might chat to you, I guess, over the course of the next couple of weeks. Thanks, Caitlin.
Anytime. Thank you.